right, Mr. Frisby, thank you so much for joining us today. And, if you could let our audience know, how long did you work in Saginaw County for the Sheriff's Department?
I worked there about 29 years or so. I started out up in the jail, as most of them do. Went on the road. Was corporal for a long time. Then I made sergeant. Came back in and worked as a shift commander, as a sergeant in the jail for a few years. And then I went back on the road. Very interesting, working both in the jail and on the road. You happen to see from the time of the arrest to the time the man goes to prison or the lady goes to prison, you happen to be in that area, everything. You just don't walk in, drop them off, go to court, and never see them again. So it was an interesting career. I really, really enjoyed it. And now I've been retired for 20 years now, but made a lot of good friends, enjoyed myself. Still have a few friends left that didn't pass away. Most of them are gone now. But all in all, I really, really enjoyed working law enforcement.
The particular area that you worked in for most of your career, what part of Saginaw County would that have been?
It would have been every area of Saginaw County. When I first started out, we had the county divided into 3 areas. We had east side, which everything across the river, of course. Then we had the northwest side and south side. So M52 was kind of the dividing line between the northwest and the southwest area. So you had a chance to work all of the areas, and so you get to know the people in the county, and there wasn't a dull moment. So a lot of nice people lived in the county. Some weirdos lived in the county, but all in all, Saginaw County had some really, really nice people.
So speaking of weird things, your old stomping ground, so to speak, that you patrolled quite often would have been the infamous Dice Road area.
Yes, that was one of my favorite areas to work. I'm not originally from Saginaw County, so I didn't know the history behind Dice Road, the Dice Road Cemetery. And of course, I believe it was in the late 1974, we started an investigation on what was simply a prowler call on Dice and Chapin Road at the home of Harold Pomeranian. And this episode really, really grew. A lot of people were involved in it. Harold, who got known by first name, would complain of someone beating on his house, prowlers around his house, and it seemed to occur when he would come home at work at night. We put a lot of man hours in on this job. At first, we kind of shoved it off as, maybe you get a lot of prowler calls and they're animals or, something crawling around. But Harold was adamant that someone was out there and beating on his house and raising all kinds of heck with him. I took the report, passed it on. Several other officers went out, took the same kind of report, and they could find no evidence whatsoever of anyone being outside his house or around his house at that time. This kind of snowballed. We had a lot of people involved in a lot of departments. Sheriff's Department, our detectives, some of our higher ranking, our captains in charge of the Detective Bureau, captains in charge of Road Patrol, the state police fire marshals, Jonesville, Lakefield Fire Department investigators, seismologists, paranormal expert from, I believe, Duke University came in, and nobody could figure out or come up with a solution to what was going on out there. It was very, very interesting. This continued. I can tell you about some of the episodes. One in particular, myself and another deputy were assigned one night to go out. It was in late, I think it was October, November. It was a really rainy night, but they wanted us to go out and stake out the home. The pounding seemed to come from the east side or the south side of his house. So my partner and I went, and right south of their house, there's a farm. There's a big old farm wagon, and it was a hay wagon, and it had a lot of hay on it and stuff. So I said, you know what? Let's lay under that. We had a clear shot of the house. It was a beautiful shot. We could see all over. So we crawled under the hay wagon. It was raining, and it started raining a little harder, and water started dripping through, and we were just about to call it. I told my partner, I said, you know, it's ridiculous. I'm not going to lay down here in the rain. So we started to get up, and all of a sudden we heard the pounding on the house. And we looked at each other and said, oh, we got it this time. So I went to the southwest corner, and my partner went to the southeast corner. And we started approaching the house, and we could hear the noise. And the closer we got, we could hear the noise, and it seemed like it moved from the southwest corner where I was at. You could hear it go all the way across, and I yelled at my partner. I said, you hear that? He said, yes, I hear it, but I don't see anything. I said, I don't see anybody either. But that sound traveled all the way across to this corner, around, and disappeared. There was nobody there. We looked for tracks. We didn't find anything that would indicate anyone was there. It was raining. It was muddy. Nobody was there. So that kind of, put a thought in our head, what the heck is going on here? So we reported it. The next time I had a chance to go out and talk to Mr. Pomeranian, I pulled in his drive. They had a vapor light on the garage. And all of a sudden, that light just exploded. And I could hear it hit in my patrol car, tinkling down. And I thought, oh, well, maybe it was just time for it to go out. I don't know. So I went in, and I talked to Harold, and he said, they're out there pounding on. He said, did you see them? I said, no, I didn't see nobody out there. I said, oh, by the way, your light went out. He says, yeah. He said, maybe they shot it out. I said, I don't know. But I said, it went out when I pulled in. He says, well, okay. So we went in the kitchen, and we're talking, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a picture on the kitchen, on the wall, just fell. It just dropped, boom. And I looked at Harold, so he says, well, there it goes. So when I looked at the picture, it had a wire on it. That wire wasn't broke. Looked at the hook that was on. The hook wasn't broke. We don't know, there's no reason for it to fall off, but he says, well, that's just one of the things that's happening here, and you guys, and he was getting very disgusted with us, We couldn't figure out what was going on. I was going to go to court one day, and I was coming down the hallway, past the sheriff's office, and I saw one of the deputies come out of the sheriff's office. Now, this deputy was a 20-year Army Ranger. Very, very brave man. I've seen a lot of people back down from him, and he's always a cool head. He always was a great guy to work with, a fantastic guy to work with. So I kind of see him come out, and it was passing me, and I says, what's the matter? You getting your butt chewed again? He said, oh, no. He says, I had talked to the sheriff about that. He said, you been out to Pomeranians? I says, oh, yeah. He says, don't go out there again. I says, why? He says, there's something evil in that house. Now, this deputy was part Cherokee Indian, and he said, there is something evil in that house. Don't go out there. I says, well, okay. So he went one way, I started the other. The sheriff came out, Sheriff Lubert at that time. And I said, Sheriff, what's going on with so-and-so there? He says, well, he was at Pomeranian's house. I says, yeah. He says, well, I talked to him and I talked to his partner, and they both told me the same story, that they were talking to Pomeranian, and all of a sudden the deputy felt something push him and then hit him and knocked him down. And when he got up, he left, and his partner left with him. And he said, his partner tells the same story. He says, I believe him. I have no doubt or no reason not to believe him. But he says, I don't know what would cause that. And I said, well, I don't either. But maybe I said, you know what? Maybe I'll think twice before I go back out there. Yeah. So anyway, we staked it out again. We had one of our captains inside the house. Okay, he was staying with his wife, and he also had his wife with him, see. So we were we had a car across the road to the north, we had one to the south, and one to the east, and one to the west. We had the whole house surrounded. We get a call on the radio from inside the house, and the captain says, the pounding is going. Can you hear the pounding? We could hear the pounding over the radio, but we stepped outside our cars. We could not hear it, but he could hear the pounding from inside the house. We couldn't hear it. We converged on the house. There was nothing there. There was no indication there was anybody on the outside. The captain came out, talked to us. She said, boys, she said, I heard that. My wife heard it. We all heard that noise. I said, well, we didn't hear it. Another set of deputies went out there once for explosions. They said it sounded like an M80 going off. They taped it. They kept track of the times that these explosions occurred. Sometimes they sounded like they were in the attic. Sometimes they sounded like they were down in the basement. Harold and his wife, he had kept a record of this, and he had a record of over 100 of these explosions. Well, the deputies went upstairs in the attic. You could smell nothing, and you smell 8, you're going to smell gunpowder, or you're going to smell something. If that many explosions, nothing. All of a sudden, he yells down. He says, I heard another one. And the deputy down below said, yes. I said, I heard that. It's down in the basement. So it was not a really basement. It was a crawl space. So they went underneath the crawl space. They could hear it upstairs. So they took the report. And about that time, we started asking for more assistance because it was getting to an area where we didn't have any expertise in it at that time, back in the 70s. They give you a gun, a ticket book, and flashlight and say, go get them. Well, they call in a seismologist because Dow has a lot of salt wells in that area. So, well, maybe it's gas coming up through the salt well. No. Dow came out. I think they may have brought this guy. They detected nothing. They couldn't detect nothing. Later on, they started having mysterious fires at the house. Jonesville, Lakeville, out in Merrill, the department, they responded there a couple of times, put out the fire, small fires. But the oddest part of the fire was the state police fire marshal did a complete investigation of one of them. This particular fire had started from a roll of toilet paper, but it was on the cardboard core inside the toilet paper was burning, between the toilet paper and the core. I believe it was Sergeant Frank Good at that time. He was a very excellent arson investigator. And he says, well, it can't happen. I said, why is that? He says, well, you got to have heat, material, and air to burn. He says, those are your three. He says, there's no air between, it's too compact. It can't. He said, I could see if it was burned inside the cardboard core, but between the core and the toilet paper, he's so compact. He says, I don't see how in the heck a fire could start there. I said, well, I don't know. You're the expert. But this continued on. This was quite a local coffee table. You get all these people in the morning and sit around coffee in the shops, or coffee shops, or and that was so. Every time you would kind of stop in, if you're going to have lunch, you're in uniform. People in Merrill, they want to know about the house on Dice Road. Well, we were kind of had a order not to really discuss that because for some reason they just didn't want it released to the press. However, somebody did release it to the press, and Harold was really, really upset with us. So eventually they moved on. I believe Mabel died. And then shortly afterwards, after they moved, Harold died. And so the house sat empty for a while, and some other people bought it. They remodeled it. It's a nice house there. But these incidents happen almost 45, 50 years ago, 45 years ago at least. And there has never been a resolve to that case. Nobody has ever figured it out, what was going on. Everybody had suspicions, but there was no 100% truth in any of it. We didn't know. We blamed everybody, blamed neighbor kids. We even blamed one of Harold's kids. Couldn't prove anything on that. So it remains a mystery to this day.
How unprecedented is something like this? I mean, in all your years of law enforcement, have you ever seen anything like this before?
Never. I've getting a lot of prowler calls, and normally it's, especially at night, it's, oh, there's somebody crawling around my house, there's somebody outside. And when you get to looking around, it'll be a raccoon or maybe a stray dog, or maybe it's Halloween time and pranks are being pulled on them. But this one here was just no solution. No one could come up with a solution. Now, we went through, I think everyone on the midnight shift or on that worked at the same shift. We changed, shift times changed a lot. But I don't believe there was one person that wasn't on the shift that I worked on or the previous shift who had not been out there at that time. And they would say the same thing. Well, you report this, we looked, found nothing. We had deputies that would say, I know what's doing that, and they would give a solution to it and say, check it out. Nope, that's not what happened. So
yeah, I mean, they tried everything. Yeah. It seems
we tried everything that was available to us at that time. We didn't have the technology that exists today. We didn't have trail cams. We didn't have the infrared cameras. We didn't have all of night goggles. We never had anything like that. So did we miss something? I don't know. We could have, yes. But then again, maybe Harold was right. Maybe there was something in that house, because it seemed like after he moved, all the activity kind of died down.
Well, what's really interesting about that is even you yourself had experiences that, that you couldn't quite explain. I mean, we could all try to, logically try to explain things, maybe when you pulled in that night and that old mercury light just blew out. Can that happen? I guess it could. Why at that exact moment? So you could just kind of chalk that up to, okay, well, maybe that wasn't necessarily paranormal, but then you go into the house and that picture falls off the wall and you said the wire is perfectly intact, the hook is perfectly intact. Mm-hmm. So it sounds to me that something would have to lift. The picture would have to lift off of that hook for it to fall. After examining it, I mean, is that possible to you? Is it logical?
The problem with the picture is that, the picture, like you said, it's hanging on a hook. It's gravity, right? Can it lift itself up? No, watching the picture, I was talking to Harold, and all of a sudden, boom, it goes down. So you couldn't see it raise up or come down. It just, all of a sudden, there it went. And Harold just looked at me and said, see? And I said, oh, yeah, I don't know about this. So, just really, really weird things were going on at the house. Dice Road is, that corridor is a strange corridor in the first place. A lot of wonderful people live on that road, but then there's a lot of strange things that go on in that road. And it was always, if you were working West County, a lot of guys would just go up and down Dice Road to just see if they could see some of these sightings that people would say, especially the Dice Road Cemetery with the ghost of Annie. And evidently a young girl back in the late 1800s. She was brought over here from England. Her dad, well, they lived in England. Her dad went insane, killed everyone. I think 2 or 3 of them, his wife, his kids. But Annie got away, and she came to America to live with some relatives in the Hemlock area. Well, eventually she married, and she married a young man who was in the lumber business. He was on a freighter running lumber from, I believe, Saginaw area over to Wisconsin or Illinois. Coming back, his ship got caught in a storm, and it disappeared. Well, when they broke news to her, they told her there was no survivors. Well, she grieved for a while, and supposedly, according to the story, she then went to the Dice Road Cemetery and hung herself. Little did she know that actually her husband was safe because his ship had sought safety into a port, had pulled into a port. So anyway, after that comes the fable of Annie at the graveyard. People had seen her, a ghost in white, floating around a cemetery. Now, like I said, I wasn't raised in Saginaw County. I was raised in some small cities just north of here. And I had not heard that story. So one night I get a call from to go out and check on someone by the cemetery, running in the road, screaming and yelling. And I said, well, okay. So I go out there, and sure enough, here's 2 girls, maybe 16, 17, maybe 15, and teenage girls. And they were screaming. And I no sooner pulled up in my patrol car, and man, they jumped right in the back seat, started screaming, started yelling. I said, what's the matter with you guys? Said, Annie's after us, Annie's after us, get us out of here. And I said, well, what's Annie got against you? They said, just get us out of here. And I said, where's Annie at? He said, he's over at the graveyard. I said, well, let me go talk to her. She said, don't go talk to Annie. I said, why not? She said, Annie's a ghost. I said, what do you mean Annie's a ghost? And then she said, get us out of here, please. And I said, well, how'd you get here? And she said, well, our boyfriends brought us out here to see it, and dropped us off. And when she started coming at us, they got scared, ran off, and left us. I said, they left you in the graveyard? He said, well, yeah. I said, well, that'd be ex-boyfriends. It was, you were my daughters. So I figured, that's probably pulling a prank on the girls, So one day in a coffee shop in Hemlock, there's a little coffee shop there. I was in there, and I was talking to some local people, and they said, well, yeah, don't you know about Annie? And I said, well, no. And then they related the story to me, of her death, and that she has been seen out there. People have reported her, seeing a ghost figure. And I've never seen it, but people in the area definitely believe in that Annie haunts that graveyard. The one story you did on the old store there in Ivy, that was quite a story. That was talk of the town for a long time. I only had one incident there, and that was reported someone was in the building. The building was vacant. The building would be occupied and be vacant, occupied and vacant. So I get there, and I meet with this complainant, and he says, well, there's somebody in the building. I said, well, what do you mean there's somebody in the building? He said, I can hear people in that building, and they're laughing and joking and laughing. He says, I said, well, the building's empty. He says, I know. So another car that was working in the Merrill area came out, and we checked the building. There's nothing broken into. It wasn't broken into. Everything was secure. So I told the guy, I said, well, I don't know. We didn't see any point of entry, and I didn't hear anything in there. And he says, well, I heard someone in there. He says, I'm not kidding you. And I said, well, okay. A couple days later, I stopped in and talked to the local boys at the coffee shop, and one of them says, well, I hear you were out on Old Ivy store the other night. I said, yeah, some guy said he had somebody in there laughing and joking. I said, I checked, there was nobody in there. And I said, I didn't see anybody. And he said, the guy says, yeah, well, you're not going to see him. I said, why is that? He said, the place haunted. I said, what do you mean it's haunted? So he said, well, one time Ivy was quite a little town. And I guess back in the early 1900s, there's had a smallpox epidemic and a diphtheria epidemic come through there, killed a lot of people. They had to burn down a lot of homes. They burned down a lot of homes out there to get rid of the epidemic so it wouldn't spread. He said that is where people used to gather at the store there. He said the post office was there. They had a pool hall there. He said that was a farming community, and they would meet there. A lot of people would go there on Saturday mornings, and they would meet and spread the news or the gospel or whatever they had to do. He said, and that's the voices that you heard. I said, what? He said, the voices of those people who perished or died in that area, they still meet at that store. I said, oh, well, okay, I don't know, I said, I didn't say anything. He says, believe me, it's true. He says, you can ask a lot of people around here, and they'll tell you the same thing. I said, well, okay, I didn't doubt him. I said, well, okay. And I had almost completely forgotten about that until one day when I was talking to you, and you asked me about it, and I said, oh, yeah, I remember one incident. But that was the only thing that, had to do with that particular store or that building. And then, like I said, but it would be occupied, it would be vacant. Be occupied and vacant. The owners that have it now, they've had some mysterious happenings there. But it's just a weird area. The whole corridor is strange.
It really is. It seems like there's some type of real energy out there, because it's such a small stretch of road, but then to have so many different hauntings out there and so many different things taking place, I think that's what's most, shocking, I guess, for lack of a better word, because there's a lot of credible witnesses that are seeing and hearing things out there. And then going back to your case at the Pomeranian house, I mean, for those that haven't seen the documentary A Haunting on Dice Road, of course, they can look that up and stream that on Amazon Prime. But going back to that case, because it's just so, for lack of a better word, it's just shocking, what happened out there, the amount of officers. When we did that investigation, we tallied that there was, from all the records that we had, which is most, the ones that are sitting next to you there, we can account for about 60 different officers that had come and gone from that house, from the Saginaw County Sheriff's Department, the local, Jonesfield?
Yeah, well, Merrill Police Department.
Merrill Police Department,
Jonesfield,
State
Lakeville.
Police.
They have a combined fire department, but those guys, the fires, that's why they called in Sergeant Good, Frank Good.
Right, and the state police played a huge role toward the end with some of the bigger investigations, I guess you could say. Now, how many man hours do you think went into that case, if you could even try to guess at that?
It was such a high number that I just can't imagine that much manpower dedicated to a prowler call. So that's because that's
how it all started.
Yeah, it's all started. Yeah. So I couldn't even come up with a good, but I know there was at least, I'd say 300-400, maybe 500 hours, because if you take the state police and the fire marshal and the Jonesville Township Fire Department and our department, plus the local departments that went out there that didn't make reports. Now you had a small police department in Merrill. They would go out there sometime, and of course they would just log it in, put it on their daily and just write down, check the area, nothing found. So you really don't know.
Yeah,
but
it's hard
on
to
our
gauge.
Department, man, I tell you what, there was a lot of man hours put into it. So
it seems that you guys really truly explored every option you could imagine. I mean, when going through those reports, and even the front page of the Saginaw News, it talks about the federal aviation coming out there because they thought, okay, well, and I think why there was so much investigation of this kind is because these officers, you guys, were out there seeing things, actually witnessing this stuff happening, hearing the explosions, not just taking the family's word for it. So it seems that you have all these different departments trying to rationalize, okay, well, what's causing it? Like you said, could it be a salt mine? Could it be the power company came out there? Even the airport. The Federal Aviation Committee went out there thinking maybe it's radar from one of the nearby airports. Nothing. I mean, every possible way that this could be explained, if there were to be a rational explanation, was completely exhausted. And I think that's what's so fascinating because, you did mention at one point earlier that you guys didn't have the technology that we have today. But even that being said, the stuff that you guys were witnessing and catching and observing, even with today's technology, I don't know that would have really made much of a difference. When and some of these police officers in the reports are talking about seeing things levitate, actually being injured by something. That's what's so fascinating, I guess, to me. In the fire department, have you heard about the story where the fire department came and the house is full of smoke? The family's calling, saying there's a fire. They get out there. They start searching the entire home. The house is full of smoke, but they can't find the source. And after a while, they start to kind of give up, and they're talking to Harold in the living room, and they look out the window and see the neighbor dancing around. Have you heard this story?
A little bit.
Yeah.
But I know the neighbor you're talking about, and she was one of the other characters on Dice Road. Hemlock Witch, or the Merrill Witch, whatever you want to call her.
Yeah, we've referred to her as the Dice Road Witch.
Yeah, Dice Road, Hemlock Witch, Merrill Witch. There were two of them out there, but the one, she claimed to be a witch. If you talked to her, she would tell you she belonged to a Wiccan. We did talk to her a couple of times, but I don't think if they made a report on it, I have never seen it. But I have heard that the guys, someone did look into it. But said, "Nah, we washed her out." So I don't know.
We know that she played a very big role in this situation, according to the family.
Yeah.
According to the Pomeranians, they really believed that this woman was responsible for what was happening in their house, and that she had basically told them in so many words that I am the cause of this, I'm doing this to you. And I guess that kind of remains to be seen. Nobody will ever really know exactly what happened out there. But what we do know is that there certainly was paranormal phenomenon taking place. Duke University, the parapsychologist
right.
Jerry Sullivan and William Roll believed it to be what they refer to as poltergeist activity, and they believed that Dwayne was the host or the agent, if you will. And from their research, it certainly is very possible to some degree. I mean, it's believed that people that are poltergeist agents largely suffer some type of epilepsy or have some form of seizures. Dwayne had multiple seizures. His age, the kind of the chaos of the family to some degree. There was some tensions going on at that time within the family, and that's pretty much believed to be the recipe for what a poltergeist is. But now that was their explanation from their expertise as being parapsychologists. But then, of course, the family believes it was a vendetta with that neighbor, and that it was black magic, witchcraft that was happening. And it seems that most of the people out in that community believe that's what it was at the time, that they seem to think it was witchcraft more so. Now, is it true from your, or let me ask you this, in your opinion, from having spent so much time out in rural Saginaw County, the rumors of witchcraft and animal sacrifice and all these things that people hear about, is there truth to that?
Someone came across a couple of dogs that had been staked with their legs tied to sticks, tied to posts, spread out, and they had bled out and had been disemboweled. And they blamed that on a group of Wiccans, or whatever you want to call them. They thought they had maybe had some, but nobody ever came up with any names or anything.
Yeah, it sounds almost more like Satanism, satanic
that's
practice.
What I'm saying. Yeah.
With all the different times that you went out to the Pomeranian house, would you say that, in your opinion, do you feel that Harold and Mabel were credible people? I mean, do you think that they were causing this in any kind of way, or do you think they were truly victims of whatever happened?
I don't think that Harold and his wife had anything to do with the strange occurrences that he reported. I believe he was honest with him, or he was honest with us, and we tried to be honest with him. He got discouraged because we couldn't figure out what it was. He couldn't figure out what it was. And he was angry sometimes, but I can see his point because we couldn't tell him. We'd say, well, we checked here, we found nothing. And so he'd look at you like, are you calling me a liar? I said, well, no, I'm not. He wouldn't say it, but you could just get that feeling that he'd just look at you and say, shake his head sometimes, But no, I don't think that Harold and his wife had anything to do with it. His two sons, Dwayne was a sick child. He did have epilepsy. His other son, straight up, Terry was a straight up guy. I don't see him doing anything. I don't know if Dwayne was capable of doing it. But some of the occurrences that happened out there, Dwayne and Terry were in the room with the officer when it occurred.
Right. So he was able to eliminate that they were the cause. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the only reason I asked that is just because, when we went out there and did that documentary, A Haunting on Dice Road, we talked to so many different people. And, once in a while you'd hear like, well, we always heard it was the sons. Yeah. And we know that they were suspects at one point. And of course, they were cleared through polygraph and other methods, like during some of those stakeouts. When activity would be happening in one part of the home, and then the boys would be accounted for. All members of the family were accounted for. But it seems like they went through quite a bit of hell, living in that home, because not only were they unable to get rest, and they were constantly having, the pounding and fires, explosions, and objects moving around on their own, but then they were also made out by the public for the longest time to be liars, or that somehow they were doing this thing to get attention or whatever the case may be, until it was literally exhausted to the point that they were proven or vindicated, basically, that it could not have been them. And that's what's so unfortunate, I guess, for that family. And as you had said earlier, that Harold died shortly after, and talking to the family, they really believe that it was the stress that just wore him down, from that whole incident, and that's what caused his heart attack. And then Mabel died shortly after.
Yeah. Well, it could have been, but like I said, he was a straight up guy when we first went out there. He was very concerned about it. He said, I don't know who's doing this, and why are they picking on me, and why is this happening? It only happens when I come home from work. And he'd come home from work about 11 o'clock or so. He worked at Dow. I'm pretty sure it was Dow.
Dow Chemical.
Yeah, he worked at Dow. And so many times, like I said, one time I knew when he got home. He said I usually gets home at 11:30. And I was working that area, so I moseyed out there and I parked the car, and I could see his drive. I could see his house. I could see him come home, got his car, went in his house. And sure enough, it wasn't, maybe a minute. And I got the call, prowler on Dice Road. And I said, well, you can put me out. I'm right here. All I had to do was pull in the drive. I was just at that close. And there was nothing there. And he met me at the door. He said, where were you at? I said, well, it's right over there, Harold. Did you see him? I said, no, I didn't see nothing. He said, well, somebody's beating down my house again. I said, Harold, I was sitting across the road. I heard nothing, and I seen nothing. And boy, he was a little upset, and I could see why. But like I said, it's been 45, going on 50 years now. Nobody's ever figured it out. We're taught law enforcement that for every incident, there's a suspect somewhere, and they will leave trace evidence if you're good enough to find that trace evidence. We never found any trace evidence.
What's really interesting is that one of the professors that came from Duke University, Jerry Sullivan, has actually located the audio recordings that he personally recorded during his time at Dice Road back in 1975.
Wow.
And that he's actually located where they are, and apparently there's about 40 different tapes, cassette tapes, and also old reel-to-reel recordings So I'm actually in the process of figuring out how to acquire those, or at least get copies of those. And really makes you wonder what could be on there. You know, he recalls definitely one-on-one interview with the family members, Harold, Mabel, Terry, and Dwayne, all the different officers that he was able to interview. And, you know, for me, it's fascinating because on one hand, just wondering what could be on those tapes. You know, could there be a disembodied voice? Could there be something paranormal that I could investigate? But even more so, just after all these years, being able to actually hear Harold's voice and Mabel's voice, you know, like I've lived this case for like 4 years at this point. And, you know, and I've only seen one photograph of them, you know, only one image of Harold and Mabel. So it's, you know, to me, it's pretty fascinating. And I wonder what, you know, what it will be like for Terry and Dwayne to be able to hear those tapes.
Oh, yeah. One of the detectives that had been assigned this case even went as far as going over to Midland and talking to the people that Harold worked with, because they said, well, you know, maybe he's got a little problem, you know. Guess what? Guess he's a straight-up man. He said he's a good worker. It's always, you know, no problems whatsoever at work. So they said, if he's experiencing something, we don't think he'd be lying about it. You know, he doesn't appear, you know, he's a normal person here at work, doesn't express any problems. We never had any problems with him. And he said, we don't know outside of work, but here he's always been an excellent worker. So
he had a solid reputation.
Yeah, he had. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, he had a solid reputation. So, and I always found it to be, you know, pretty reasonable, except as the continued and we couldn't explain, or we couldn't find an explanation to it and appease him with it, then he became extremely upset with us. So that's why we started turning over the investigations to people who had a little bit more technical knowledge than we did at that time. State police came in, find nothing. Fire marshal, they couldn't explain it. Parapsychologist come in, and he explained a little bit to him. But we never really come to a solid conclusion to what was occurring out there. You know, you don't know, you know. So it is one really great, not a story, I imagine, but it was a great investigation. When I go through there and I look at some of these reports that were done in 1974, and I know the officers personally, I worked with them, hung around with them, fished with them, hunted with them, I know these officers. I can tell the ones that were getting disgusted by going out there because their reports are very, very short. Checked area, nothing found. Checked area, nothing found. You know, but then you'll see another one where the officer goes out there and he does 1 or 2 page report, and at the end of it, he can't justify anything. He doesn't know what happened other than what was reported to him and what he found. So there was a lot of good officers that were involved in this case.
You know, you were quoted in our documentary as saying that even a homicide doesn't get that much investigation from that many departments and that many individuals. And it started as a prowler call, you know, and it was never explained. I mean, isn't that, does that stick with you even after all these years, the fact that there really is no explanation?
Yes, it does. Today, if you have a homicide, the state police comes out with their crime lab. You have the one guy that takes pictures. You have one guy that takes prints. You have this in here. This one over here interviews. This one tapes the whole thing. You know, a variety of stuff they have nowadays. When we'd investigate a homicide, in those days, we would call our detectives out, and our tech sergeant would come out, and he would process at the scene, come up with a suspect, interview the suspect, go get the warrant, and that's it. And it happens a lot of times, you know, we're very, very quick and precise, very good investigation, but with the technology we had back then. The manpower that was spent on this case alone probably, I would say, at least tripled, or maybe as 4 times as many hours spent on this prowler call than there had been on a homicide at that time. So, yes, I've seen a lot of homicides that were investigated, but I've never seen a prowler call that escalated like this and kept snowballing until it became so big that we had, well, you notice how many agencies we had in it, how much manpower was out there, different people, state police, they never came up with why. Sheriff's Department, we never came up with nothing, right? The state fire marshal, I don't know what house full of smoke. Jonesville Lakeville Department, fire department, a great little fire department. Volunteers, 3 o'clock in the morning when it's 20 below, they'll jump out of bed and come and put out a fire. They're dedicated. They couldn't figure it out. Seismologists, there's parapsychologists from Duke. Came up with his explanation. Maybe he's correct. I don't know. I don't know that much about, the paranormal. It's just unbelievable. It's anyone that could read the episode or read the story of the newspaper that's published, which Harold was very, very upset because they had promised him that this would not be leaked to the public. And someone on our department gave the information to Saginaw News. If anyone that doesn't believe that happened, more than welcome to look at your book, and you'll see the reports there that nobody ever figured it out. So
definitely goes down as one of the biggest mysteries, doesn't it?
It's one of the biggest mysteries that I experienced in the years in law enforcement.
You and a whole lot of officers.
Oh, sure. Yes. Oh. Even today we talk about it. They'll bump me, when we did the episode there, or when we were on your Hunting in the Heartland series. I heard from some deputies that I hadn't heard from in 20 years, and they shot me a message on the computer and says, "Hey, I remember that. Remember us going out there?" And I said, "Oh yeah, you were out there too, We got one down in Florida. He was out there. One still lives in Saginaw. One of my partners passed away recently."
That's Mr. Diffin?
Yes.
Yeah.
Jim was a straight-up guy too. But like I said, it's something that has stuck in their minds because they'd ask me, "Well, did they figure that out?" I said, "Well, I don't think so. That's why they did that series on it."
Right. Yeah.
So
I don't know that it'll ever be explained. I don't think it can be. I think it really comes down to, could it have been occult practice, or was it indeed a poltergeist phenomenon? I mean, in my mind, it's one of those two. But I guess that's it's subjective because there's certainly very strong evidence of both, and maybe in fact somehow it could have been both. I mean, it's a juggernaut of a case. So, but Mr. Frisby, I can't thank you enough today for coming down and talking to us about all the mysteries and lore of Dice Road, and thank you for what you're doing today.
Well, I thank you, and Jamie. It's wonderful working with you two again. I've watched your progress that you're making, and it's just fantastic, And a lot of times when people say, "Would you know that Steve Shippy?" I said, "Oh, yeah." "How'd you know him?" I said, just one of those things.
Just kind of happened.
Yeah, it just kind of happened. And my son, now he's not a young man anymore. He's in the 50s. Lives in Maryland, and he's just wild about you. Bo Frizz, you'll see. This is Bo Frizz sometimes.
Yeah, I've seen, yeah.
Yeah, that's my son, Brian.
Yeah.
And he's always shooting me messages. Have you seen Steve? I said, "Well, no, he's very, very busy man now. You know, he's got his own series. He still shoots a little, and I told him, he does podcasts. He does a lot of things. He's busy. I don't bother him that much. If you know, I figured I talk to him sometimes on a computer, once in a while on the phone. And he said, "Oh man, I really like that series." I says, "Well, keep watching because it's going to get better."
That's for sure. Yeah. You know, we're not done with Dice Road. That's for sure. I'm going to get those tapes. I'm going to listen to all of those recordings, and we're going to keep moving it forward. You know, maybe one day we will have the truth of what happened out there somehow, some way.
You know, I'd really, I hope you keep me posted on and involved in it, because I would like to know myself. It would solve a great mystery, and like you said, it happened in 1974, 45, some years ago, maybe, you know.
Yeah.
Still a mystery, unsolved.